Hi, fantasy readers. This is Corinne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you're listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Today's story has such a unique flair. The moment I started reading it, I knew I was going to ask the author if I could share it. I mean, how often do you find stories about giants? And how often do you find stories about sphinxes? Today, you get both, along with a really sweet hint of romance that makes you root for this poor underdog of a giant. It's written by Kristi Simonson, who owns thelionscall.com, an older-than-Google Narnia fan site, as well as squeakycleanreviews.com, which offers book reviews from a Christian perspective. She lives in California, where she divides her time between raising her kids, writing, web development, and the painting and crafting of beautiful trifles from other worlds. Today's narrator is Paeter Frandsen, host of Christian Geek Central. Stick around to the end, or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from both the author and the narrator. For now, please enjoy The Courtship of Giants by Kristi Simonson.
She'd laughed at him. He'd spent weeks meticulously carving the 6-cookie mold, pouring all his skill into each of the hollows, from the intricate floral details on one, to the motif of the winged pigs favored by lovers on another, to a pair of playful griffins he knew would tickle Bryn's fancy. That's what love-struck lads did when they wanted to court a lass in Halcyon, land of giants. They carved love tokens and gave them as gifts to declare their intent. Spoons, bowls, elaborate rolling pins, most of them too fancy to use. But a cookie mold, Aaron Stormbright had decided, would be useful as well as beautiful. A cookie mold would be used again and again, and every ornate treat that came out of the mold would be a reminder of their affection. He had spent 3 weeks and 5 days toiling lovingly over every detail. Then he'd packed a picnic lunch in a basket and presented his token to Bryn Kane's daughter, and she had laughed. So Aaron Stormbright had done what any nervous young giant lad would do in such circumstances. He'd run. "Aaron, wait!" she'd called after him. She'd probably meant to apologize. She wasn't cruel, he knew that, but a bean of doubt in her feelings for him had been sown. His gift hadn't been enough for her. Aaron plodded home, head down and shoulders slumped, contemplating this turn of events. He had thought Bryn liked him, was even fond of him. Hadn't they spent hours among the cages and kennels in her backyard, discussing her hopes of working with exotic creatures? Hadn't she admired his carvings when she passed Master Stratus's stall in the markets? Clearly, he hadn't understood her feelings at all. When market day came 2 days later, he found himself once again working the carpentry stall with Master Stratus, to whom he had once been apprenticed. He dutifully unwrapped and set out carved goods of all varieties that he and Stratus had crafted. They stocked a bit of everything, from trinket boxes and ornate bookends to bowls, trays, and utensils. They displayed a tiny pre-built house designed for those small folk who climbed the beanstalks and occasionally got stuck in Halcyon. These came with free delivery, and of course of all shapes and sizes. Aaron looked at the harps glumly. He'd dreamed of presenting Bryn with one following the birth of their first child. He'd planned to craft her the largest, grandest harp in the country. But that dream was so much sawdust now. He swallowed as another thought struck him. What would he do if Bryn happened to pass their booth today? He groaned. Maybe he'd just sink behind the carvings, pulled under by the weight of his mortification. "Still moping, I see," said Stratus as he arranged a series of nesting dolls, the smallest the size of a human infant, the largest taller than an elephant. He blew a shock of graying hair out of his eyes. Aaron straightened. "Sorry, master." "So the girl laughed at you. Why don't you do something about it?" Aaron stared at him. "Like what?" "Talk to someone else. I thought Bryn was fond of you too, but if she ain't, Celeste Cloudberry wouldn't say no to a walk. She glances your way every time she passes." Aaron slumped again. She probably needs a new ladle. Nobody needs a ladle that badly. Now listen, boy. Maybe I just need to find something Bryn does like, Aaron said, not really listening. Something she'd treasure. Stratus shook his head. She knew it was a love token. It was supposed to be about you and her, not the item itself. If a token from you didn't move her, she's a lost cause. Maybe she didn't like the workmanship. Thunderclaps, Stratus muttered. I've never seen such a beautiful mold, and that includes the one I gave Effie when we were courting. But maybe if I... Stratus waved his hand. I can't watch your moping. Go walk the market. Talk to Celeste. But Aaron didn't want to talk to Celeste. He thought of talking to Bryn, laughing with Bryn. He remembered meeting her when they were children, running through the market stalls together while their parents shopped. She'd helped him nurse a fledgling great hawk that had fallen from its nest. He'd told his mama he meant to marry her someday. His mama had smiled, but he'd never changed his mind. He found himself wandering toward the creature keeper's stall. Bryn loved animals, always had. She'd talked about opening a menagerie someday where she could raise and study exotic beasts. She already had a sizable collection of creatures in her home and backyard. Maybe he should have built her a bird cage. His eyes wandered over the stall which held animals of every sort, from enormous rocks to simurgs and griffins. He picked up a shaggy gargantuan pup and scratched its ears. He didn't want to buy it for Bryn. It wasn't unique enough, but it made him feel better. "Looking for something, Aaron?" asked the stall keeper, a middle-aged giant named Hale, whose voice always came out a little too loud, as though the noise of the animals he traded had dulled his hearing. "Something better for Bryn Kane's daughter," Aaron said, setting the pup back in its basket. He waved a hand at Hale's collection. "But I think she's got most of these." Hale nodded. "Reckon she does, as she bought most of them from me. She was back again the other day looking for something new, but I ain't got any sphinxes." "Sphinxes?" "Yep. I've been on the lookout, but I haven't been able to get one yet. They're hard to catch, and I'm not as young as I used to be. Tricky to care for, too. Not worth the trouble to keep a stock of them." "Where do they live?" Aaron asked, the idea taking hold. Surely if he returned with a rare, exotic beast she'd been especially looking for, she wouldn't laugh again. "They like the mountains," Hale told him. "Like to roost in trees or rocky cliffs. Head up into the high country." And that was how he ended up on top of Mount Mirsky, holding a long-handled conical net. He mostly used it when the warming winds blew wyvern flies down from the mountains and into his garden, but it ought to work to catch a sphinx. The creature would only be a little longer than his forearm, not counting the tail. He didn't know how much of the day he'd be spending up in the mountain, so he took along a lemon trout sandwich wrapped in a cloth for his lunch. The area he had chosen featured rocky heights on either side of a long, forested valley with a river running through it. As he explored, he spotted a couple of half-lion, half-eagle griffins looping around each other in an aerial dance, but these weren't his quarry. He saw a manticore, a creature with the body of a lion, a face like a man or a giant, and a tail like a great scorpion. He gave it space, mindful of its sting. Common manticore stings weren't usually deadly, but they were extremely painful. The creature scuttled between two rocks, and Aaron kept looking. Finally, he found what he was looking for, not high up on a cliff or perched in one of the red rock trees, but sunning itself upon a wide, flat stone next to the river. The creature, a male, looked like the griffins in most respects, from the furred golden lion's body and sharp claws to the massive wings, but unlike a griffin, it lacked an eagle's head and beak. Rather, its face, covered in fine golden fur, resembled that of a man. But how to catch it? He moved quietly, hiding his lunch in a hole at the base of a nearby tree so it would stay cool rather than spoil in his pocket. Then he considered his options. He didn't want to get too close and frighten it away, so he laid his trap among the trees in a clearing upwind so the scent of the bait would be sure to carry. Hale had told him sphinxes were partial to vegetable lamb, a plant that grew woolly, sheep-like creatures with tasty meat out of the pods that drooped from its main stalk, So Aaron had cut a couple of chops from his garden. He laid these on the ground, withdrew under the shadow of the trees, and stood still as stone, waiting, his net clutched in his hands. The first to investigate his offering were the pair of griffins, but he shooed them away with a few waves of his net. The second was a wild great cat, as long as his arm from nose to tail. His neighbors kept a pair as pets, but they'd always looked too smug for his liking. He waved his net again, and the great cat slunk away. He waited a long time after that, until the morning chill had faded and the sun had passed its zenith. Was the Sphinx not interested? Perhaps it had eaten already, and had lazed by the river to doze after its meal. Maybe he should have kept it in his line of sight. The shadows on the mountain grew, and Aaron wiped his brow. It was well past noon. He should eat. He strode back to the tree where he had hidden his lunch, hoping the Sphinx wouldn't decide to steal his bait in the meantime. He reached into the hole, and his hand closed on darkness. His lunch was gone. He heard a soft hooting noise and turned. The Sphinx sat no more than 10 steps away, with half a lemon trout sandwich in its mouth, looking immensely pleased with itself. Well, if it liked this form of bait better than vegetable lamb chops, who was Aaron to argue? He took a careful step forward, but the creature launched into the air and flew over his head. He headed back toward his trap, hungry but amused at the creature's cheek. Should he wait by the chops again, hoping the creature hadn't found his sandwich too filling? Hope that it liked the taste of vegetable lamb as much as lemon trout? He picked up his net and prepared to wait by the chops. Except the chops were gone. Aaron blinked. Had the Sphinx snatched the meat while he walked toward his lunch, then beaten him to the tree and stolen his lunch too? Or had it eaten his sandwich first, then stolen the meat? He shook his head with a wry smile. Round 1 went to his quarry, but if the creature thought this was over, it was sadly mistaken. He walked home, disappointed but determined to return. The next day, he decided to secure his lunch by hanging it in a basket from a branch. He defied the creature to eat from a basket that was fastened shut at the same time it hovered in midair, and if it tried, maybe he could catch it. He stood still and waited, downwind from both items, one eye on the basket, the other on the vegetable lamb chops he had laid out on the flat stone next to the river's edge. After perhaps 3/4 of an hour, the creature appeared. It tossed its head and passed by the chops as if it found them suspicious, but began to investigate the basket. Aaron inched closer. If only it would stay in place. The Sphinx swooped back and forth around his lunch, inspecting it, but just as Aaron lifted his net, the beast perched atop the basket itself, snapped its teeth, which must have been sharper than they looked, and severed the rope. The Sphinx dove after the plummeting basket, caught the handle with its front claws, and took off with the entire basket in its possession, narrowly missing Aaron's swinging net. He waited the rest of the day, but it never returned for the chops. Round 2. He sighed, still amused, but also hungry. Definitely hungry. The following day, he kept his lunch in a satchel at his side. He laid out the chops and waited. After a few hours, the Sphinx crested the rim of the trees and circled twice. Did it suspect he was there? The creature dove at the meat, plunging so fast Aaron almost forgot to move. He recovered just in time to swing his net, which snagged on one of the Sphinx's shoulders. The creature shrieked and tried to launch itself into the air, but its wings were fouled. It thrashed wildly, and Aaron feared it might hurt itself. But after a moment's struggle, the net popped past the shoulder and fell over the rest of the animal's body. The Sphinx hissed and spit from inside the net. Aaron could scarcely believe he'd achieved his goal after only 3 days. He made a fist between the hoop of the net and the wriggling Sphinx and started back down the mountain. The animal squirmed and snarled. Before long, Aaron wished he'd prepared a better way to carry it. He didn't want it to injure itself or get any of its vicious claws into his hands. He frowned. Weren't sphinxes supposed to ask riddles? If you answered them correctly, they would calm down. He was sure he'd heard that. But this sphinx hadn't posed any riddles. Maybe it was sick. He hoped Bryn would be able to sort it out. Envisioning her reaction when he presented her with his gift, he smiled and continued on his way. The Sphinx hadn't given up its squirming, but just as Aaron adjusted his grip, he heard a rending sound and the net grew much lighter. He raised his fist in disbelief. The Sphinx had slashed a hole in the bottom of the net, which was now empty. He turned to find the Sphinx winging up over the treetops, making a joyful noise that fell somewhere between the roar of a lion and the scream of an eagle. Round 3. Less amusing. The next day he tried placing the chops on the Sphinx's preferred riverside stone again. When the Sphinx came, he stepped out, swung his net, slipped on a patch of moss, and fell, along with his lunch, into the river. Round 4. He'd missed 3 lunches in 4 days. The next day, he sighted the Sphinx among some rocks in the long morning shadows. It eyed him disdainfully and disappeared around the corner of a protruding cliff. Aaron trod carefully after. He thought he heard a flutter of wings, but when he rounded the corner there was nothing to be seen but a small dark hole in the cliff face. Humans might have called it a cave, but to Aaron it was only a little larger than the size of his hand. He got down on his hands and knees and peered inside. "Got you," he whispered. Most of the animal lay in shadow, but 2 golden paws lay illuminated by the light from the entrance. He reached slowly inside. He didn't think the creature would have room to get around his arm, but he didn't want to startle it. His hand had just brushed against the furred front paws when he heard a snarl, and pain like fire bolted through his hand. He yanked it out with an undignified howl and stared as it swelled to twice its usual size with a horrible red welt. A manticore sting. From a rock ledge just above he heard a flutter and looked up in time to see the Sphinx take wing. His whole arm was in agony. He spent the next 2 days at home treating it by bathing it in the stream by his house and drinking loftwillow tea. Round 5. He was definitely a dog person. The next time he ventured up the mountain, he carried a mended net and a newly fashioned birdcage. He laid out another couple of chops, further apart from each other this time to make them harder to snatch. The Sphinx came, seizing the first piece of meat. Aaron brought his net down, but missed as the beast launched out of the way, holding the treat in its mouth. It threw its head back and swallowed the morsel, then circled, eyeing him. It still wanted that other chop, and finally dared a second dive. This time Aaron aimed true. As soon as he nabbed it, he knelt by the birdcage and thrust his arm into the net. He hissed and sucked in a breath as claws and teeth assaulted his hand. "Thunderclaps!" He pulled the squirming thing out of the net and shoved it through the door of the cage, slammed the door shut, latched it, and breathed a sigh. He cradled his right hand. "That's not so bad, is it?" he said to the Sphinx. It stared at him, cocking its head to one side as if listening. Why wasn't it asking any questions? He looked at his injured hand. Red scratches marred the surface. He'd need to clean those. "Think I'll call you Pestilence. Pest for short. Don't suppose Bryn'll keep it, though. She's a softy." The Sphinx snarled and lunged at the wooden bars of the cage. Aaron flinched, the memory of teeth and claws all too fresh. "None of that," he said. "You don't like me, and I can't say I like you, but Bryn will take good care of you, so just you settle yourself." The Sphinx did not settle. It kept launching itself against the bars. Aaron started to worry. "Come now, you don't want to show up to Bryn's with your feathers all ruffled, do you?" The Sphinx quieted at the question, but watched him through narrowed eyes. "That's better. You can't get out, so just relax and enjoy the trip." But just as if it had taken "you can't get out" as a personal challenge, Pest butted its head against a pair of bars, turned the head sideways, and pop! Out of the cage came the head, followed by the entire body, as if the Sphinx were made of liquid. Aaron was so surprised he just sat there with his mouth open. Pest shook itself as if to set its feathers in order, gave Aaron an insolent smile, and launched up into the sky. And that was round 6. The next day, Aaron returned with a large wicker picnic basket, the same one he'd packed a lunch in when he'd gone to present his cookie mold to Bryn. The basket had a hinged lid, and he had lined the bottom with vegetable lamb chops. He set the basket upright on the grass, with its lid leaning open just past vertical. He tied a piece of twine to the lid. When the Sphinx entered the basket to steal a treat, Aaron would pull on the string and the lid would fall, trapping Pest inside. He laid his net on the ground beside him as a backup. Then he sat back in the shadows and waited. And waited. Pest wasn't quick to come this time, but after a couple of hours, during which Aaron had to frighten off 2 more great cats and a curious young roc, it landed on the rim of the basket and peered inside. Aaron tensed, ready to pull the string the moment Pest stepped inside. Pest leapt down from the rim of the basket onto the grass, and then, with a cunning smile on its all-too-human face, knocked the basket over, spilling the food and spoiling the trap. It ducked its head and began to eat. Thunderclaps! That got the critter's attention. It gathered the wind beneath it and soared into the air, then turned to launch itself, claws out and teeth bared, directly at Aaron's face. He ducked, shielding his face with his hands, and was rewarded with more scratches. "Leave off, you windswept abomination!" He kept howling insults, and the creature continued to attack. He snatched his net from the ground and swung it through the air, more in an attempt to protect his face than anything else. "Wretched thing!" he howled. "Why would anyone want to catch you?" Pest left off its assault, hovering in midair and tilting its head to one side. Aaron had no idea why it had stopped attacking, but it gave him the opening he needed. His next swing netted the beast. He wasted no time in transferring it to the basket, where it clawed and shrieked. His poor hand looked little better than the red tally marks on a Charybdian scoreboard. He latched the basket and held it firmly closed, tucking it under his arm. Hissing emanated from beneath the lid as he made his way down the mountainside. He hesitated when he reached the bottom. Should he head home, wash up? He was certainly rumpled after hours of crouching among the trees. On the other hand, it might not be a good idea to keep Pestilence in the basket too long, even if he had finally quieted down. "Feeling better?" Aaron asked, and was answered with silence. No, he'd better get the creature to Bryn as soon as possible. She'd know the best way to make it comfortable, even if Aaron was feeling personally aggrieved with it at the moment. Besides, who knew what it might try if he held on to it any longer? Bryn's parents' house lay near the perimeter of the village. The front faced away from him, so the first thing he saw upon approach were the number of cages and kennels where Bryn kept her growing collection of creatures. He was about to head around the front, but slowed at the sight of a cage that hadn't been there before. This cage was enormous, half as tall as the cottage and wider than it was tall. It was tightly woven with narrow bars, and inside, preening itself, was a sphinx, an elegant, sedate, graceful sphinx. None of those terms applied to the creature he carried in his basket. He must have netted the most contrary specimen ever produced by the species. His heart sank. His quest had been pointless. She already had a sphinx, must have gotten one since she'd last talked to Hale. Aaron was too late. He turned away from the house, not sure what he should do with the creature in the basket. Should he release it back into the mountains? Maybe sell it to Hale? He'd only taken a few steps when a soft voice spoke behind him. "Aaron?" He turned around, clutching the basket instinctively. "Bryn! Hello." From the basket, the sound of angry hissing resumed. "You left so quickly the other day," she said, "and I came by your house this week, but you were always out. I wanted to—" Bryn broke off, staring at the basket. "What is that?" Aaron backed away. He'd rather fall down a beanstalk hole than admit he'd brought her a gift she already had. "Never mind that. I should head home." She wiped her hands on her apron. "You're not staying?" Did she sound disappointed? He couldn't be sure. No, I should go." The basket on his arm shook with snarls and hisses. Bryn fisted her hands on her hips. Aaron Stormbright, what in Halcyon is in there? Nothing, he said. It sounds like several nothings, all of them angry. Did you net a mockery of manticores? No. Well then? He stared apprehensively at the shaking basket. It's a sphinx, he muttered. Really? She said, her voice bright with interest. Yeah, he said, and then more words rushed out of him, his voice rising as he struggled to be heard over Pest's noise. I didn't realize you had one, see, and she's beautiful, a real lady, not like this fellow. He's a right bother. He? She said, sounding even more animated. She stepped toward him, hands outstretched. Aaron tried to swing the basket out of her reach. What? She asked, frowning. Didn't you say you brought him for me? Yes, but... Bryn wrested the basket from him and peered inside, looking delighted. Careful, he warned. He'll take your hand off. But she was already lifting the lid. Oh, aren't we handsome? She asked the monster, who quieted at once. Aren't we a good boy? She crooned. No, he's not, Aaron warned. He's a vicious... Hissing erupted from inside the basket. Bryn let the lid drop and fixed Aaron with a perturbed stare. Don't you know how to talk to sphinxes? She asked. How to talk to them? No, But Bryn waved him to silence. How do I say this politely? She glanced skyward, then at him. Would you mind very much not speaking for the next few minutes? Aaron stared at her, unsure whether to feel offended or bewildered. But Bryn held her finger up in warning, so he simply nodded. She lifted the lid of the basket again. Now, where were we? She said in that same soft, crooning voice. Weren't you just the handsomest fellow? Aren't you a clever boy? She reached her hand in and scooped the creature out. Aaron tensed, waiting for it to start scratching, expecting it to try to escape, but the sphinx lay relaxed and content in her grasp as she stroked its belly and cuddled it as though it were a baby tigling. How did you... he began, but Bryn shook her head forcefully. Isn't he gorgeous? She said, then looked up hopefully. May I keep him then? Would he mind her taking this vicious beast off his hands? He shrugged and nodded. She was welcome to the thing, but what she would want with it when she had such a fine example already, he couldn't fathom. Bryn put Pestilence back in the basket, held a finger to her lips, then beckoned for Aaron to follow her. She approached the cage that held the other sphinx. Sophia, she called, would you like some company? Sophia made no response. All of her attention was on the basket in Bryn's hand. Bryn set the basket down and knelt next to a little door in the cage. With one hand, she scooped Pest out of the basket. He squirmed a bit but didn't scratch her as she opened the cage door and slipped him inside. She then closed the door and stood, watching. Aaron watched, too. Sophia sat up straight and eyed her new houseguest, then began to pace the far end of the cage. After a moment, she spoke. To put together, removing the skin, the pale fruit within. Pestilence sat still and silent, then responded, Pear. Sophia gave a rumble of approval, and Pest padded toward her end of the cage. Bryn clasped her hands together, then turned to beam at Aaron. He had no idea what had just happened. After a few minutes of watching the cats, who appeared quite pleased with their newly formed acquaintance, Bryn took Aaron's hand. He had to keep from crying out at the sharp pain in his still tender skin, but he wouldn't relinquish the connection until he had to, and pulled him back through the yard until they were well away from the cage. Did you see? She asked. Isn't it wonderful? Can I talk now? She laughed. Of course, I'm sorry. Sphinxes are riddlers. They prefer to be spoken to in questions. Statements set them off. I'm still learning how to do it. It's so easy to forget. Oh. And suddenly his whole miserable experience made sense. How Pest had grown fierce whenever he spoke, except when he spoke in questions, including the one that had quieted the beast long enough for him to swing his net. Why would anyone want to catch you? It all seemed so obvious now. But did you see? Bryn gushed. She posed a question, and he answered it. He shook himself. She was talking about the riddle again. What did he mean by pair? It's the answer to the riddle, she said. Sphinxes like to play with words that sound alike but mean different things. A lot of their riddles are like that. Pair, spelled P-A-I-R, can mean to pair two items, or can be a pair of items. P-A-R-E means to cut the skin from a fruit or vegetable, and a P-E-A-R is a small fruit from the world of the small folk. That's clever, he said, bemused, but I'm not quite sure why you're so delighted about it. Aaron, male sphinxes hardly ever speak. It's the females who do all the riddling. When a female poses a riddle and the male answers, that's part of a mating ritual. She clapped her hands. This is wonderful. Did you know sphinxes bond for life? His throat went dry. That was what he had come here to discuss. A courtship, a lifelong bond. But he couldn't form the words all of a sudden. I think I'll call him Hector, she continued. But how did you know I wanted a male? He wanted to look clever for her. He really did. I didn't, he said, forcing his mouth to form words. I didn't think you had any sphinxes, and Hale said you wanted one, so I decided to try and catch one for you. Bryn's mouth fell open. You caught him? Yourself? But male sphinxes are notoriously difficult to trap. I didn't know how I would ever get one. How did you do it? He spread his hands as if to say it was nothing, but winced when he moved his fingers. Your hands, she cried. What have you done to yourself? Hector wasn't eager to come, he said wryly. She took him by the elbow and ordered him to sit down on the back step, then stepped into the house and returned a moment later with a jar of pungent ointment. She sat down next to him and began applying it to his hands. The pain cooled almost at once. That's strong stuff. Essence of catechin. I've got some catechin in my garden. Never knew it could do that. What made you want to tear your hands up like that? She said, looking cross. You did. Me? I figured I had to do something really impressive to get your attention. He felt his cheeks warm up. You laughed at my cookie mold. Bryn froze in the process of putting the lid back onto the salve jar. Then her face turned scarlet. Ridiculous man, she choked out, and her voice caught. Aaron wasn't sure if she was near laughter or tears. I wasn't laughing at you, she said. I was laughing because I burnt the last batch of anise cookies I made. I always burn anise cookies. You might have given me a spoon or a bobbin or a bowl, but no, you had to pick the one thing I can't do. And now he could see her eyes shining with unshed tears. Don't cry, Bryn, he whispered, passing her a handkerchief. He stared out at the poles where quite ordinary beans grew in the back garden. You know, he said, I always burn anise cookies too. She sniffed and looked away. Then you ought to find yourself a bride who can make them. I'd far rather eat them burned, he said. We could burn them together. She bumped him with her elbow, then laid her head on his shoulder. I'd like that.
I hope you enjoyed listening to The Courtship of Giants by Kristi Simonson, narrated by Paeter Frandsen of Christian Geek Central. If you want to read more by Kristi, go to KristiSimonson.com to find more of her books. You can snag your own free ebook copy of today's story while you're there. And make sure you check out the gallery with all the artwork she's done. I'm always amazed when writers have other artsy talents because I can barely draw stick figures. If you enjoyed listening to Paeter narrate the story, you might also enjoy listening to his audio dramas at spiritblade.com or his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. Have you subscribed to Finding Fantasy Reads? If not, find the little subscribe button on whatever app you're currently using and click it. Not only does it help me out, but it notifies you when new episodes are uploaded, so you'll never miss another one of these fantastic stories. As always, I will have links for all the sites I've mentioned in the show notes. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.